Good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening for the virtual community meeting for the Devil's Knob Complex. I am Brenda Bowen, Information Officer with the Rocky Mountain Type 1 Incident Management Team. The purpose of our meeting this evening is to provide you an update on the current status of the Smith and Big Hamlin fires, which make up the Devil's Knob Complex. Before I introduce the speakers and we get started this evening, the way this is going to work, we did ask for questions in advance. We got a couple. I have provided those to the speakers already, and they will be incorporating their responses to those to the extent that we can answer them into their presentations tonight. If you do have questions as the speakers are providing their updates, please go ahead and put those in the chat at the bottom of this meeting, and we do have information officers that are monitoring those, and we'll be answering as many of them as they can or passing them on to us to ask the presenters at the end of the presentation. Before I introduce our speakers tonight, some statistics from this morning's update, which was based on last night's infrared flight. The Smith fire is 43,226 acres, and Big Hamlin is 18,957. So for our lineup this evening, we will have a fire weather and fire behavior update from our fire behavior analyst, Glenn Lewis. Immediately following Glenn, we will have an operations update from Operations Section Chief Joel Peters, and then followed by closing comments from Deputy Incident Commander Bill Honnenberg. At that point, we will wait a few minutes, see if we have any questions that have come in, and we will do a Q&A session at the end. With that, Glenn, I will turn it over to you.
Good evening. I'm Glenn Lewis, Fire Behavior Analyst with Rocky Mountain Incident Management Team 1. So for the last couple of weeks, we've had pretty mild weather conditions over the fire with fairly mild temperatures. The smoke has been hanging in the air with that indicating that the air is very stable. And that's kept the fire area pretty shaded, and that's resulted in a little bit more moderated temperatures and a little bit higher relative humidity, and really hasn't had a lot of activity. What that's done is moderated the fire behavior, and it's kind of limited fire spread during that time. On Tuesday, we had a little change in the weather condition, actually a fairly significant change in the weather conditions. The air was much more unstable, and so what that did was allow the smoke to disperse out and let the sunlight through. And what that did, even though it appeared like it was really smoky, that was some upper level wind that was coming in from the fires down farther south of us. So that didn't really filter out the sunlight it had in the past. The air was pretty unstable, and so that allowed the sunlight to get down to the fire area. That solar heating made it a little bit warmer, and it also then served to drop the relative humidity down. So it's making it actually really dry compared to what we had leading up into that. So all of that happened at the same time that things were really becoming unstable, and so the air was really opening up. It was like turning open the damper on the chimney. There was no longer versus choke down like it was prior to that. So there's a lot of vertical development that allowed the fire to really get going and to get a strong convection column, which then causes the fire to really accelerate its fire movement. So we did see some pretty good spread on the fire with lots of spotting and stuff through that. That really lasted mostly for that day, and then behaviors started to moderate a little bit more since then. Tonight, we're going to see a lot more of that moderation. Going to have a chance for some scattered showers tonight, possible isolated thunderstorms. Relative humidity is going to be about 100% in most areas around the fire. And low temperatures are going to drop down into the 50s. So it's going to carry over into tomorrow morning. It's going to be much more moist, much more cooler with highs in the 60s. And relative humidity won't drop down much, probably even get below 60%. So that's going to significantly moderate fire behavior for tomorrow as well. So the outlook beyond that is for much more seasonal temperatures and more moist conditions, where relative humidity is going to be dropping down into that 40 to 35% range, maybe as a minimum. And so again, that's going to really moderate fire behavior again for for at least the upcoming week, early into next week. That's going to be the scenario, and probably even into mid next week, we're going to see much cooler and moist conditions, which really going to moderate fire behavior well into next week. Then we'll see lots of variability going on at that point for what the outlook looks like that. But for the time being, from now into early next week, really much more moderated fire behavior without a whole lot of activity happening out there for that means. And that's all I've got.
Thank you, Glenn. Joel Peters. I'll provide an operational and tactics update for the Devil's Knob. We'll get started up on the northwest corner in Branch 1. Up in Branch 1, Division Echo. We have a bit of containment lines that have been shown on the map for a significant amount of time, but we still have quite a bit of work in there due to the dry fuel conditions and the amount of mop-up required. So we've got a lot of patrol and mop-up going all the way up over into Division Foxtrot. Division Foxtrot, over the last couple days, has finished up some burning out operations along their containment lines in there. Some of that was done previous to the wind event and weather that Glenn talked about that occurred on Tuesday afternoon. So during that event in Division Gulf, we had some spot fires that got established across the north side of our containment lines in Gulf. Thankfully, we were able to contain those by the next operational shift with hand line, dozer line, and hose lays, and got those secured. As of just here a few hours ago, those were in really good shape and have not moved at all. So one of the big issues we've got in the Foxtrot Gulf area is this large unburned island. There's been some additional burnout operations that have been completed in here to help fatten that containment line so you don't have any issues of the fire having the ability to move north. Moving into the division between Gulf and Alpha, right in here below DP9, there's a lot of active fire out in some very steep terrain that we've not been able to put any fire crews in due to the snag hazards and the steep terrain, like I mentioned. So up to the north into Division Alpha, we have established some indirect containment lines to be able to develop some containment here. That big event on Tuesday is really what changed some of the plans in here. We had a very significant run out towards the rough patch complex that caused us to have to really evaluate some of these indirect lines. So currently some of the tactics on dealing with this, I kind of equate these distances in here to the coast of the ocean. Of maybe 2 miles down the coast is as the crow flies is 2 miles, but on the ground following that coastline is much, much further, exponentially further. This is a very steep bowl, lots of snags with a lot of fire activity in there from that main run. So we're definitely looking at an indirect option, but one of the things with the weather that Glenn's mentioned that we're really looking at on this north end is how can we make that smaller. So we've got people out there looking at some of these other options on these roads like the 257 that's a little bit closer to the main fire edge, and how we can potentially neck that down and make that indirect piece as small as possible and potentially go direct in locations where we safely can do so. The biggest thing is, like I mentioned, just the large amount of country that folks are dealing with in here, and at times a serious amount of limited resources to be able to achieve those objectives. So we'll move a little bit further over into Division Bravo. During that main run on Tuesday, the 27 road that runs north and south throughout Division Bravo was heavily compromised. Many spots over the road, numerous snags came down and more or less closed that road on us. And we're not even able to get fire traffic north and south through there anymore. So they kind of had to bump back down further to the south through there, and heavily focused on the Ash Valley area. Currently the Ash Valley is sitting much better as far as the defense of the structures. They spent a lot of time in there, had significant amounts of fire backing down in towards those structures, and had to do some defensive firing to contain that fire around the structures and prevent any damage to those. During that same event on Tuesday up to the north, they also had some spots come over to the other side on the east side of the Ash Valley that got established up here. doing a lot of scouting in there, and there's really no opportunity to contain those pieces due to the resource concerns on heavy equipment and the ability to get those resources in there to tie that in. So today that was not very active. Yesterday it moved around quite a bit, but today it was not all that active. So moving down into a little bit further to the south into Division Charlie, looking at this piece, the big concern in there has been the finger in the Buckeye fire from 2013. A similar scenario in a lot of these old burn scars is it's very steep and numerous snag hazards that's really not allowing us to get in there and put ground resources in. They've been able to make a little bit of a heel here to stop some progression to the north, but that finger has not moved in about a week and a half. So we've putting a lot of patrol in there and making sure that that's not going to go anywhere. But we've also got a small indirect piece in there. If that activity were to pick up and were to try and move southward, we've got a plan in there to be able to kind of hook that back in. From Charlie, moving a little bit back further to the west, they've just been doing a ton of that similar patrol and mop up in there. Lots of heat holding in the heavier fuels and the large duff layers that's causing just extended time in there to get that mopped up and secured. During that event, they did not have any issues further down in Charlie. All of that was able to hold. So right now, the plan with Charlie, they're looking at some contingency lines further to the south. If any of this activity were to try and move towards the south, and Division Bravo is looking at the 28 road here and ability to tie into the Rough Patch complex down here. And kind of the big summary of these indirect lines and what we're putting in is we're kind of thinking worst case scenario here. What's this fire going to do potentially if we dry back out and get another wind event? We want to be ready for it. But with the current conditions, we're going to try and minimize this as much as we can, is what the resources allow us to do, and the risk reward for our firefighters on the ground. We'll move further down south into Branch 3 with the combination of several fires, the biggest being the Big Hamlin. The west side, Division November, and up into the Mule Creek fire has been looking very good for numerous shifts. They've had no issues in there. Once again, the heavy patrol and looking for any hot spots and making sure those are good and out. Wrapping down around to the southern end, and just up on the other side into Juliet during that same wind event. We had multiple areas over the complex pick up during that. They had approximately 8 spot fires down here just south of DP 45. That kind of merged in together. Combination hand line on the north side, and then on the south side some heavy equipment line to get that tied in. As of this afternoon, they had it pretty well secured, line all the way around it, and hose lay around most of it. They also had an IR picked up a spot further out to the east, just a little bit off the edge of that finger, but they were able to also successfully get that lined and squared away. Moving up to the north, had some burnout operations several days ago along the old Whiskey fire. We're not able to get into a lot of these other roads due to the kind of the similar hazards of numerous snags and steep terrain. So they did some burnout operations up to the north, up near the world's tallest sugar pine there, which is well outside of the fire area, but up into that area. And that was all secured and good during that event of this large acreage growth. They didn't have any issues in there, thankfully, and were able to keep that secured. They had one spot earlier on, but that's fully contained at this point. Moving along across the north side of the division, there's quite a bit of fire up in top in this old burn in that Whiskey fire, and it's just kind of moving around a little bit. And right now we're just keeping a good eye on it, doing a lot of patrol along the road, and only doing what's necessary in there. We're not initiating any more fire in there. We don't feel like we need to do that right now, and just kind of letting it slowly back down into there. Once again, that snag hazard is really keeping people out of there and kind of where we're at. And that's kind of the operational update I have, and Bill will be next.
Good evening. I'm Bill Honenberg, Deputy Incident Commander with the Rocky Mountain Area Type 1 team. We took command of the fire Monday morning and transferred command with the team that was here. It was the Red Team, Southern team from Florida. And we understand they had a public meeting, it was a couple weeks ago, so It's been a while since we've talked with you, so we appreciate the opportunity for those of you that have joined with us here to bring you up to date on where we're at with this fire. So I'm going to start with some general kind of information. This fire has burned 63,000, just over 63,000 acres. We're at 35% containment. That containment number hasn't really changed much, and you might wonder why. And it's because even though we're increasing our containment line, the fire is growing in size. So the number sometimes remains static, even though there's a lot of work being done on the ground because the fire is still growing. It particularly grew Tuesday, just 2 days ago. That gave us a pretty good test, and we did have fire come over our lines in places, and has caused us to reevaluate some of our strategy, and I'll touch on that in a minute. Just a few more facts on this fire. We have just over 700 people working on it. We've been right around 700 to 800 people now for a couple of weeks, and in fact, I think it was pushed 900 maybe a week or so ago. So got a lot of people committed, a lot of people working hard to bring this fire into a condition where we will feel a lot more comfortable about it. We spent just over $36 million in total. One thing we do have going for us, our fire behavior analyst talked quite a lot about the weather. So, you know, it's here, that weather forecast he shared with you, or that outlook took us to the middle of next week with a pretty good cooling period with some more moisture, potentially even some rains here and there coming in the next few days. So that's going to get us to the middle of September. You know, days are getting shorter, nights are getting longer and cooler. That definitely all helps. And we know that there's roughly a 50% chance that we will see season ending by the end of September here in this country. It's the other 50% that we're concerned about, in that the fire season sometimes we know extends on well into October. We don't see conditions like you had here just about a year ago, with extreme fire indices, as well as very hardened, hot and dry winds out of the east with extremely aggressive fire behavior. We're not seeing that in the forecast, but we are seeing continued drought and continued very low fuel moisture. So that gives us some of the challenges we're dealing with now. Before I get more into some of the fire activity in some detail, I just wanted to mention that listen to the news for your community, listen to the news nationally, and COVID is a huge effect. It's a huge effect to how we operate and engage. You can imagine when you have 700 people working together, and sometimes in fairly confined places, that's a cause for concern. We're doing a whole lot of things to keep firefighters spread out. Meetings such as this, virtual rather than in person. We're doing a lot of those things. Obviously, we want to keep our firefighters safe and healthy. We also don't want to bring COVID to your community. So we're being really careful about that with our interactions, you know, using face masks, using all kinds of things, everything we can, kind of what's become a more normal practice for how we manage wildland fires, to keep firefighters separated and practice social distancing. And we're doing that with a variety of things. We have a really spread out camp. We're going to be moving firefighters out into what we call forward operating bases to get them out more scattered around onto the perimeter of the fire. I want to talk a little bit about the future, well, the current status of this fire, as well as the future of where we're going. So we did have a question about the amount of indirect fire line we're using. So there are things we look at and consider, and sometimes on fires that are primarily national forests, we don't go as direct as other firefighting organizations might on private land, and that's in large part due to values on private land versus values of national forest land. And really, I'm talking primarily about timber values. So some things we look at and consider, and every fire is different. This fire is primarily national forest. There are values we know on private land and tribal land scattered all around the perimeter of this fire. So, you know, we're pretty conscious of those high value resources just outside national forest lands. So let me just give you a quick rundown of things we consider when we elect a strategy. We look at the values that we're protecting. We look at the resources we have available to protect those fires. the number of resources we have are adequate, but they're by no means what we might like to have to be more aggressive with this fire. And that's in large part due to fire activity in California, scattered throughout Oregon and Washington. We continue to be nationally at the highest preparedness level that we have, and that's preparedness level 5, which means we're short of resources. So when we look at our options for engaging direct or indirect, direct tactics take a lot more people. And so we're doing the best we can with the number of people we have and putting them in the most efficient places to be able to make progress on this fire, and that's an indirect strategy. The last thing we want to do is commit a lot of people to strategies that won't work. So we look at another factor, so then that leads me to the next factor we looked at is probability of success. If we can pick the place as an indirect strategy and then use fire as a tool to remove the fuel with some firing practices that both limit fire effects with putting fire on the ground in a manner that we're not going to do a lot of damage to the timber stands and to the ecosystem versus wildfire coming through. That's a strategy that we like to use, considering the probability of success and what we can do with firing operations. And then risk to firefighters. When we pick the place, we pick the ridge, we pick the road, we pick the location of the right kind of fuel and those kind of things, there's a lot less risk to our firefighters and, again, a higher probability of success. So that's why we are using on this fire indirect strategies. You people, I'm certain, are familiar with this country, some of the steepest country we encounter in wildland fire operations and some of the heaviest fuel we encounter. In this case, mostly live fuel, but a lot of heavy dead fuel as well. So the future of this fire, let me just move on to that and look ahead a week or two. I talked a little bit about the fire weather, fire behavior, and where this fire might go. We think more and more each day that we're going to get into a more normal fall weather pattern. And we believe with that, the additional growth should decrease, that daily growth should decrease substantially over the next week or two. And I think that's the future. Some of these indirect lines we use, the fire may never come into play with those indirect lines. So we're preparing lines that are some cases are those that we believe we won't use, but we may need them. So they will be in play should the weather turn dry here after this current cooling and somewhat wetter period. So that's the picture looking forward, and we want to thank your community for working with us here. You know, our primary goal is we know we have values at risk. Specific in this case, I'm going to mention Ash Valley, those homes there particularly, and we think we've made a lot of progress there and looking in pretty good shape specific to those values immediately at risk, which have been immediately at risk, and I think we're in pretty good shape on that now. So I'm going to quit with that. Turn it back to Brenda. I don't know if she's saying no on additional questions. So where are we at? Ready to? Well, thank you, everyone, and you know you have the means to contact our public information officers with social media, phone, etc. So keep them informed if you continue to have questions, and we will engage and do our very best to answer your questions and keep a good level of information flow with you. So thanks for coming on the viewing here this evening. Thank you, everybody. Good night.